I've always been fascinated by how we take certain facts and assemble them into historical narratives. So we tell a story with the facts. And Mark Twain supposedly said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And I do think it's interesting to look at the kinds of themes that tend to emerge when we look at our history and those that recede. That's very much how I look at this receding mystery of Dutchess County's Chief Crow. I live very close to a burial ground that has a New York State marker explaining that it's the resting place of Chief Crow. But the moment you start peeling away the layers, questions arise. And we like to think of history as very black and white. There are facts and there are fiction. But I think as you get into this story especially, you find that there's a lot of fluidity there. And these are not necessarily two big, distinct, inseparable areas. I was particularly taken by this quote by a folklore professor. He says, "We map what we see, making some features, ignoring others. History is not the past, but a map of the past, drawn from a particular point of view to be useful to the modern traveler." And I guess what we'll look at today is what was useful to the modern traveler in the 1930s, and how does that look to a traveler of today? In my mind, it's kind of like putting the volume up on certain things and down, or if not completely off, on others. I'm going to mention largely three towns. One is the town of Milan in northern Dutchess County, and just to its east, Pine Plains. And just north of those two is a town called Gallatin in Columbia. And right where they intersect is a little place called Jackson Corners. And it really is a meeting place of these three areas. So I'll be referring to those three towns quite a bit. I wanted you to understand where they are. In Jackson Corners, this is the burial ground that I was referring to. It's very small, but it's very close to the road, and it's circumscribed by a stone fence. It literally says, "Indian burial ground, Chief Crow and other Mohican Chikomicos of Moravian faith buried here. Last burial about 1850. State Department of Education, 1935. So that seems pretty straightforward. The few stones that remain, I'm not sure if they ever had writing, but they certainly don't have writing now. In the past decades, people mentioned that they saw as many as 10 or 12. Now I think you're lucky to see 5 or 6. So what is the story of Chief Crow and other Mohican Chikomicos? Well, the Chicomico village is very real. It's in Pine Plains, what is now Pine Plains. And in 1742, Moravian missionaries arrived at this village, Indian village, to convert them to Christianity. And the Moravian missionaries were working all across the colonies. They had tried in Georgia. They were doing a good deal of work in Pennsylvania and elsewhere in New York. But in 1742 particularly, we're focusing on the village of Chicomico, which is actually near the Connecticut border. This illustration is actually of a Moravian missionary in Pennsylvania with Iroquois, but I think it nicely sets the tone of the expectation that the Moravian missionary is here to bring light, education, religion to the heathens, if you will, with how they would have described it. And so the predicament that the Native Americans found themselves in, as depicted by the author and painter DeCoste Smith here, which he called conflicting faiths, is this is, again, happens to be an Iroquois with a mask in the right hand and a cross, which is a little hard to see, but a cross in the left hand, and he's contemplating his Christianity and paganism, and working through that with the Moravian missionaries. If you look really just at the face value of it, it does raise some questions. Yes, there were Mohican Chikomicos of Moravian faith in the area, but there are a couple of gaps. One of the gaps is distance. The Chicomico village was 15 miles southeast of where this burial ground is located, which is fine. That's not all that far, but it's just worth noting that it's a bit of a gap. There's the gap in time. The Shikomiko village, the Moravian missionaries operated between 1742 and 1745 and were highly controversial. They were ultimately driven out of New York. The colonial governor not only forbade them to practice, and this would be both the Moravian missionaries and the Native Americans converting to Christianity. The state not only forced them to cease and desist their practice, but forced them to leave New York, which virtually all of them did, moving to Connecticut and Pennsylvania, where they had more freedom. If that weren't enough, the local settlers actually petitioned the state for permission to wipe out the Indians, assassinate them. The official request was denied, but the climate was set, and there really was not much favorable climate, that's an understatement, for the Native Americans to remain. So they started to leave. The other gap I find interesting is that in 1924, Poucher and Reynolds did an exhaustive study of gravestones in Dutchess County, 19,000 inscriptions in the town of Milan. They found 441 inscriptions. Even though they mention very small burial grounds, they do not mention this particular burial ground, and it is on a roadside. So it can't be that they didn't know it was there. There was just some reason they weren't mentioning it. And if it were an Indian chief's burial ground, why wouldn't that be mentioned? Anyway, there is one written source that refers to Chief Crow, and I found it just a couple of months ago. It was in the local newspaper in 1934, and it talks about a meeting that was had, a historical meeting, about the Indian occupation of Gallatin. Again, that's the town just into Columbia County. Herman Case recounts the episode of his mother captured by an Indian chief and carried to school. Stories reminiscent of the Indian occupation of what is now Gallatin featured a historical meeting held at Locust Ledge, home of Mrs. C.V. Harrison, town historian for Gallatin. She's important. We'll explain why in a moment. Among those who attended and gave from family legend and records were Herman Case. One incident he cited was of a little girl on her way to school who passed the chief's wigwam each day. This, by the way, would have been about 1835. One day, this chief gave a big war whoop as the little girl passed near him. She was frightened and commenced to cry. The chief then told her, quote, "Me no hurt little white gal." Then he grabbed her in his arm and ran all the way to the schoolhouse with her and placed her on the steps saying, "See, chief, not hurt little white gal." It turns out she is the mother of Herman Case, who is telling the story. He says that the Indian Chief Crow lived in Jackson Corners with his wife Nancy, which is interesting, 13-year-old granddaughter, we'll come back to that, and that they're buried at the Indian cemetery there. Interestingly, it says when he sold the land to the whites, they allowed him to use a log cabin where he and his family completed their lives. Most of that land was sold in the early 1700s, so I think this would have made Chief Crow around 150 or 200 years old when he was running with a little girl in his arms. Anyway, he's obviously an extraordinary character spanning a number of centuries. I had mentioned the point that the host of the gathering was Edith Harrison. She's important because she was the person who submitted over 100 applications for 100 different signs in Columbia and Dutchess counties for this state education department program of roadside markers. So alas, you see her name and signature in October of 1934 when she applied for the sign. So, a lot of questions. How do we solve this mystery? We actually, I suggest, look at another mystery to help us figure that out. But I was reading History of Rhinebeck, written in 1908. Howard Morse said, quote, "The colored people of Rhinebeck in the old times cut something of a figure." And he goes on to say what they did and who they were. and that a portion of the cemetery is set apart for the colored people. And I thought, well, why is it past tense? Why is this in the old times? And I looked at census records to see what was happening, and it was really extraordinary because cities, even cities like Poughkeepsie, were growing rapidly, but the rural portions of Dutchess County were declining rapidly after the Civil War. If you look at the population of the town of Milan in 1820, there were 1,846 people. Slavery did not end in New York until 1827, and we see that the so-called 65 non-white people included 18 who were enslaved and 47 who were free, the majority of whom, it is safe to say, were more likely to be African American, given historic context. By 1930, there are only 622 people left in the town of Milan. There are 2 African American families, the Frasers and the Jacksons, who have been in Milan for over a century each. Their families have been in Milan over a century each. And I thought it was interesting to note that by 1980, as the population started to get back to where it was 160 years earlier, that no one identified as black in the census, 12 identified as Spanish. The makeup of the town had really changed. And I just find it interesting that it was in this gap. Sometime, I would suggest, between 1924, when Poucher and Reynolds did an audit and didn't mention the burial ground, sometime between 1924 and 1934, when the application was made, is when this story was created or emerged. So, one more thing that will help us is to consider that at the period of time, let's say in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, it was very common for landowners to bury their members of their family in the front yard or in the backyard, literally. And there are a number of reasons for doing this. Right around this burial ground, there are 2 family plots, I guess you would call them. This is an example of one. It's very overgrown. It is very much on the roadside, like the burial ground we're discussing. But in this particular instance, the stonecutter, who I think did an exceptional job in 1835, that's very distinctive, if kind of rough. This remains intact and tells us that Jacob Shear is buried here. No such luck with our burial ground that we're discussing. Nothing remains to be read. But if you operate from the assumption, or remind yourself that during this period of time, it was very common for family members to be buried on the land they owned, it is worth looking at the land ownership of the burial plot. And it commences in 1821 when this triangular piece of land is created by Frederick Bathrick and sold to Jacob Lyle. And that happens in 1821. And because Jacob Lyle shows up in the censuses quite a bit, we know a bit about him. He has a wife, Betsy. We know he's a freed color person. And we know that in 1840, there is a girl under 14 living there. And the 3 of them are all identified as free colored persons. We also happen to know that Jacob Lyle served in the Revolutionary War in New Jersey. We know that because he gave 14 pages worth of sworn testimony. He himself could not read or write, but before Judge Thorne, he swore. It took over a 10-year period between 1833 and 1843. Half dozen back and forth with Washington for his pension application, which was even after 10 years suspended for some bureaucratic reasons about not being specific enough about certain things, not denied, but suspended and not granted, pending further review in detail. Must have been incredibly frustrating, to say the least. So Jacob Lyle, we lose track of him after 1844. And by this time, he and his wife are quite old. It's very likely they passed away in the 1840s. It's highly unlikely they moved anywhere else. And the land ends up in the hands of Nancy Bradford. Nancy Bradford, we find from her death notice in 1865, is a 75-year-old woman who is Black. And the story continues. She is a cook from Albany, and we don't know much about her, but we do know that I found this very interesting. This was an inventory of her estate. She had 14 kitchen chairs and was a cook, so I can only imagine that she had some great dinner parties. I don't know. But here she is. This is a depiction of her just the way that image of the Revolutionary War veteran African-American, that was actually Salem Poor. I put these in not because they are pictures of these people at all, quite the opposite, but I like to put them in because it reminds us that we're talking about real people here. So this is what she might have looked like or could have looked like. Okay, the story continues. Nancy Bradford dies in 1865, and the next time the land is sold, something interesting appears in the deed. In 1871, it's very clearly called out that this little plot of land is known as Nancy Crow Place or Lot. Now, why would Nancy Bradford's place or lot become Nancy Crow's place or lot? And by the way, that reference remains there to the deed that is extant today. It refers to the fact that right after her death, or in the 1860s, this lot was known as Nancy Crow Place or Lot. So the newspaper article would have us believe that Nancy Bradford married Chief Crow and became Mrs. Chief Crow, Nancy Crow, but I think that's that there are all sorts of problems with that story. Some say it could be a reference to her color. Also, there's the distinct possibility that Jim Crow was used as a reference in the northern states, in New York, in the early 19th century to refer to African Americans. Do you remember Jim Crow was a theatrical production that was really launched in New York, and the research I've done suggests that it was a common reference to, it was obviously a derogatory reference. They say it is said not as derogatory as some, but obviously still some sort of derogatory reference to her color. So in any case, we don't know how Nancy Bradford became Nancy Crow, but she has to this day. And I just think, you have to start to add up some of the evidence. On the one hand, Chief Crow. There really is no evidence of Chief Crow other than this newspaper article and the sign application from Edith Harrison. On the other hand, we have a fair amount of documentation on the landowners who are most likely buried there. That leads me to believe that what we really have is an African-American burial ground, that a Revolutionary War veteran, Jacob Lyle, rests there with his wife, Betsy, that Nancy Bradford is there, and that other people of color rest there. Now, of course, we can't know someone's 100% certainty, 100% genetic makeup. And there were mixed race people, there were other race people. But it is hard to believe that Milan had such a large African-American community in the early 19th century, and yet there's no evidence of it. So I couldn't help but think that this discovery feels a little bit like what happened in New York City in 1991, when, through excavation in downtown, they unearthed a Black burial ground. And then in 2006, Vassar, Professor McAdoo, and his students used kind of a technology to determine where graves were that were unmarked. And there were quite a few that they identified in the so-called Negro burial ground. And I couldn't help but think that there is a growing awareness of an early rural African community, or urban one, as in New York City, and that African Americans had to be buried separately, and they were often buried either with something wooden cross, or something that would not endure, or in an unmarked grave, but they were separate and away. And I think it's good that there's an effort now to discover where they rest. So here we are. This whole idea, I guess what fascinates me, and I think what's important, is why do we turn the volume up on some things and down on others? And this is, I think, there couldn't be a better example of really what's going on here. I think that when I look at the stories I read, we're very comfortable turning up the volume on the last of the Mohicans, that last Indians of this section buried here. That's from the sign application from Edith Harrison in 1934. We, like Native Americans, as chiefs and as medicine people, I couldn't help. We've been looking at the sign that is technically in Milan. If you look at a sign that's technically in Pine Plains, it says, under the pine trees, chiefs of Mohican Indian tribes were buried, and Pine Plains got its name from these pines. If you go to Gallatin, that town just into Columbia County, there was supposedly a descendant of the Mohican Shecomicos who was the last known Indian resident of Gallatin. So he was the last of the Mohicans of Gallatin. Every town seems to have a chief, a medicine man, or someone who is the last of the Mohicans. And yet we don't seem to turn the volume up, and we seem to almost actively sometimes eliminate or erase someone's history. An African-American Revolutionary War veteran. We don't talk much about slavery. In New York, we tend to prefer to talk about our anti-slavery activities and abolitionist tendencies, which are great, but New York did practice slavery until 1827. And I think you're beginning to see, whether it's the slave market on Wall Street now getting formal recognition and public acknowledgement and depiction, or the burial ground we talked about, there is an effort to turn up the volume on these things. But I feel, in the town of Milan, there really is an opportunity and a need to somehow identify the people who really rest on this road on Turkey Hill in Milan. And that is my pursuit, to get some sort of recognition and acknowledgement of those who really served and lived in Milan. So thank you for listening.